Memory rarely tells the truth, especially when it brushes up against fear. We like to think we recall movies the way they were, unchanged and untouched, as if our minds were perfect archives. But when horror presses too close, the mind reshapes it, softens it, dims the edges, and turns something once unbearable into something oddly harmless. It's not accuracy, it's survival. Some horror films have been collectively rewritten this way. Entire audiences remember them as goofy, campy, or strangely charming relics from decades past. They recall the posters, the jokes, the oddball characters, but not the weight that hung in every frame. They forget the quiet cruelty, the emotional violence, the suffocating bleakness. They forget these films because remembering them honestly would mean confronting the shadows they once planted. Tonight, we return to those shadows. We revisit 15 films whose reputations have been dulled by nostalgia and misremembered through a comforting haze. Films that seemed lighter only because your mind refused to hold on to the darkness. This isn't the Mandela effect. It's something far more human, a silent rewiring of memory to protect you from what disturbed you the most. So settle in, slow your breathing, and let the real versions come back into focus. Because once you see these films as they truly were, you'll wonder what else your memory has been hiding from you. Fact 1. The Children, 1980. To many, The Children exists as a strange cult relic, its premise so absurd that it gets remembered as unintentional comedy. Radioactive fog, blackened fingers, murderous children, something to laugh about rather than fear. But a revisit dissolves that comfortable distance and exposes a film steeped in dread. The children, recalled as campy villains, are frightening in their stillness. They do not snarl or scream, they move with the eerie calm of sleepwalkers. Their innocence, rather than softening the horror, amplifies it. Every frame featuring them feels like a betrayal of the natural order, a quiet announcement that something impossibly wrong has taken root. The adults, remembered as confused caricatures, reveal themselves as grieving parents trapped in an unthinkable dilemma. How do you defend yourself against the very beings you love most? The rural landscape fields, empty roads, lonely farmhouses mirrors the emotional desolation of the story. And the kills, often treated as cheap effects in memory, gain a disturbing weight when seen as acts of affection turned lethal. Memory dismissed it as silly. In truth, The Children is a slow, suffocating tragedy disguised as pulp. Fact 2. The Stepfather, 1987. In collective memory, The Stepfather is treated like a tidy suburban thriller, an unmasking of a dangerous man hiding behind a charming facade. But that trimmed-down version removes the film's most unsettling truth. This is not a story about a killer infiltrating a family. It is a story about a man trying to force reality to obey his fantasies. The Stepfather, remembered as charismatic and mildly eccentric, is far more terrifying when revisited. His smiles are rehearsed, his politeness is brittle, his dreams of the perfect home are so rigid that any deviation, any disagreement, any flaw registers in his mind as betrayal. The suburb he inhabits, often recalled as warm and safe, becomes a stage where he performs normalcy, like a role he's memorized but never understood. The violence, softened in memory to thriller outbursts, is chilling precisely because of its logic. He doesn't explode, he resets. Each new household is another attempt to rebuild a fantasy that can never survive contact with real people. And every failure is met, not with grief, but with cold, methodical erasure. Rewatching The Stepfather reveals the true horror, not that he kills, but that he believes he's right. Fact 3. The New Kids, 1985. Over time, The New Kids has been softened into a teen revenge thriller, something loud and rebellious, but ultimately harmless. That version of the film is a lie memory tells to avoid acknowledging how genuinely disturbing the story is. The siblings, remembered as plucky newcomers, are caught in a hostile town that treats vulnerability like blood in the water. The bullies, often recalled as exaggerated punks, reveal themselves as predators, driven not by angst, but by a chilling, escalating obsession. The fairgrounds, misremembered as a dramatic set piece, becomes a bleak arena where childhood joy is stripped away and replaced with primal fear. The violence isn't flashy, it's intimate, personal, and fueled by a desperation that grows heavier with every scene. What nostalgia hides is how fragile safety truly is. In The New Kids, it takes only one spark, one humiliation, for an entire community to look the other way while cruelty grows teeth. Memory made it rebellious. The film is ruthless. Fact 4. Monkey Shines, 1988. To many, Monkey Shines survives as an unintentionally strange thriller, the killer monkey movie, joked about more often than revisited. But a second viewing strips away that misplaced humor and reveals a harrowing narrative about control, loss, and the frightening vulnerability of the human body. The protagonist, remembered as frustrated but resilient, appears utterly broken when seen through adult eyes. His paralysis is not a plot device, it is a prison. The monkey, often recalled as mischievous or exaggerated, mirrors his deepest anger, acting upon impulses he cannot physically express. Their bond is not comedic, it is parasitic. What once seemed absurd now feels suffocating. The monkey's intelligence, its jealousy, its unnervingly human reactions all become symbols of the protagonist's deteriorating sense of agency. The home transforms into a battleground where every object, every shadow, every fleeting expression becomes a reminder of power slipping further and further away. The film's tension doesn't come from the threat of violence, it comes from witnessing a man watch his own life move without him. Memory turned it silly. The truth is anything but. Fact 5. The Funhouse, 1981. Many remember the Funhouse as a colorful carnival slasher, bright lights, playful atmosphere, teenagers running from danger in a maze of attractions. But that memory is a polished illusion. A rewatch exposes a film soaked in grime, sorrow, and the quiet misery of people living on the fringes of society. The carnival is not lively, it is exhausted. The rides don't sparkle, they groan. The performers aren't quirky, they are worn down, hiding their bruises behind grease paint. What audiences often misremember as a monster in a mask is something far more tragic, a malformed, mistreated soul shaped by the cruelty of those meant to protect him. His violence, while horrifying, emerges from a lifetime of humiliation and exploitation. In this light, the monster suit becomes a shroud for a childlike pain that no one ever acknowledged. The teenagers once recalled as carefree victims appear lost, vulnerable, unprepared for a world where innocence is chewed up and spit out. The carnival's twisting corridors and flickering bulbs echo with a sense of entrapment, reflecting not only the literal chase, but the emotional truth that none of them, killer or victim, ever truly had a way out. Memory turned the Funhouse into a roller coaster. The film was always a descent. Fact 6. Tourist Trap, 1979. Tourist Trap is frequently remembered as little more than a bizarre mannequin movie, an eccentric novelty overshadowed by its odd premise. But revisiting the film reveals a work steeped in surreal cruelty, a nightmare where every object seems to possess a hollow, watchful consciousness. The mannequins, often dismissed as laughable props, confront the viewer like frozen witnesses. Their blank eyes and slacked jaws distort the boundary between human and imitation. What once felt goofy now becomes deeply unsettling. Each figure, a lifeless echo of fear. The isolated roadside attraction, remembered as a charming relic, decays into a labyrinth of uncanny spaces where sound behaves unnaturally and light feels heavy. The villain, softened by nostalgia into a quirky oddball, emerges as a fragmented psyche, capable of violence without warning or remorse. The film toys with the viewer's sense of reality until every wooden face, every whispered voice, every creaking board feels like part of a ritual meant to trap the living alongside the inanimate. Memory made it strange. The film itself is terrifying. Fact 7. April Fool's Day, 1986. In popular memory, April Fool's Day is the safe slasher, the gentle prankster of the genre, a film people recommend to those who can't handle real horror. But that recollection ignores the emotional tension pulsing beneath the surface. The movie is less about jokes and more about the delicate, dangerous balance of trust between friends. The island setting, often remembered as picturesque, becomes subtly menacing when revisited. The isolation feels intentional, as if the house itself is staging an experiment. The pranks, softened in memory into harmless gags, reveal themselves as calculated intrusions, tiny fractures in relationships that were already fragile. As fear spreads, the laughter dies. Every conversation sharpens. Every glance becomes a question. Who is pretending? Who is hiding something? Who will turn next? Even the famously debated ending, often dismissed as lighthearted, carries an undercurrent of melancholy, a reminder that not all wounds are physical, and not all games end when the punchline drops. Memory turned it playful. The truth leaves a bruise. Continue? Fact 8. Happy Birthday to Me, 1981. Over the years, Happy Birthday to Me has been remembered as a wild, twist-heavy slasher defined by outrageous kills and melodramatic flair. But that is the safe version the mind keeps. A fresh viewing reveals a film drenched in psychological anguish, a story less about murder and more about a young woman's fractured grip on reality. The protagonist, often recalled as glamorous and enigmatic, now appears painfully fragile. Her memories slip like water through her fingers. Scenes audiences once shrugged off as stylish eccentricities reveal themselves as terrifying lapses in perception. The famous shocks, those elaborate, absurd kills, lose their playfulness and take on a somber, almost mournful tone when seen through the lens of her unraveling identity. Even the setting, remembered as a polished prep school playground, becomes oppressive. Hallways stretch endlessly. Faces blur in and out of recognition. Friends behave like strangers, and strangers behave like threats. The film quietly, methodically dismantles her sense of self until the final reveal no longer feels ridiculous, it feels inevitable. The real horror of Happy Birthday to Me isn't the twist. It's realizing how easily the mind can betray you. Fact 9. The House on Sorority Row, 1982. In the nostalgic retelling, The House on Sorority Row is a campus thriller with bright colors, pranks, and a breezy 80 seconds vibe. But the truth beneath that softened memory is much darker. The film is less about college life and more about guilt turning friendships into battlegrounds. The prank, at the heart of the story often recalled as silly, unravels into something cruel and irreversible. The girls' laughter, softened by time, becomes strained and panicked upon rewatching. Their sorority house, once remembered as lively and glamorous, transforms into a claustrophobic maze where every room hums with unspoken fear. What audiences misremember is the emotional collapse. The way paranoia creeps into whispers. The way friendship fractures under the weight of a secret too heavy to hide. The killer's presence, often lumped into generic slasher imagery, is inseparable from the guilt that wraps itself around each girl's throat like a tightening rope. Memory painted it pretty. The film always knew it was tragic. Fact 10. Curtains, 1983. Curtains often survives in memory as the one with the skating scene, a stylish slasher with theatrics and eccentric flair. But watching it again reveals a film steeped in manipulation, emotional violence, and the quiet desperation of women trapped inside a system designed to consume them. The actresses, remembered as archetypes, now seem painfully aware of what is being demanded of them. Their interactions, once perceived as melodramatic, take on anxious rhythms shaped by exploitation. The director, often misremembered as merely intense, becomes the architect of a psychological arena where ambition and cruelty are indistinguishable. Even the iconic ice sequence changes meaning upon rewatch. It is no longer a striking visual, it is a metaphor for women expected to perform under pressure so cold it could shatter their bones. The mask, the motion, the silence, everything feels like a commentary on how the industry freezes identity until all that remains is what can be sold. Memory chose the prettiest image. The film always held something far more painful. Fact 11. Evilspeak, 1981. Many recall Evilspeak as a camp relic of the Satanic Panic era, a film defined by primitive computer graphics and exaggerated supernatural antics. But that memory glosses over the true weight of the story. Rewatching it reveals a cruel, suffocating descent, driven not by demonic glamour, but by isolation so complete it begins to rot the soul. The protagonist, remembered by some as a shy underdog, now appears disturbingly hollowed out by humiliation. His daily torment is not comedic or over the top, it is intimate, relentless, and quietly dehumanizing. The computer, once seen as a cheesy novelty, becomes a vessel through which his pain metastasizes, channeling rage he never learned to express in any healthy way. The violence, mislabeled as shock for shock's sake, grows organically from his psychological collapse. Scenes that once felt absurd now read as devastating, revealing a boy who reaches out for something, anything that will finally give him power. When that power answers, it does so with a coldness that suggests it was always waiting. This is not camp. It is the sound of a lonely mind cracking open. Fact 12. The Pit, 1981. Over time, audiences reduced the pit to an oddball creature feature, something bizarre enough to joke about but too strange to fear. That version of the film is a mirage. Rewatching it reveals a story steeped in psychological distress, where the true monster is not in the forest, but in the unraveling mind of a lonely child. The boy at the center of the story, remembered as awkward and mischievous, now feels frighteningly unpredictable. His isolation is not quirky, it is crushing. His behavior, softened in memory to childlike mischief, carries an unsettling edge that hints at darker impulses shaped by neglect. The trolls, often recalled as silly puppets, become symbols of the distorted fantasies he clings to when reality fails him. The film's tone is relentlessly uncomfortable. Ordinary objects, bicycles, books, stuffed toys take on an eerie weight when placed in the orbit of a child, slipping further into delusion. Even the forest, remembered as a simple backdrop, feels like an extension of his internal void, a place where imagination and cruelty merge. The Pit was never a goofy monster movie. It was a warning: neglect can twist innocence into something unrecognizable. Fact 13. The dorm that dripped blood, 1982. In the collective imagination, The Dorm That Dripped Blood is often dismissed as a cheap student slasher, grainy, chaotic, and straightforward. But a second viewing reveals a far bleaker narrative stitched into every cold frame. The abandoned dorm does not feel like a playground for horror tropes, it feels like a tomb awaiting its final occupants. The isolation is overwhelming. Empty hallways echo with a kind of mechanical loneliness, as though the building itself resents the presence of those who remain. The characters, remembered as thin archetypes, show cracks of desperation and fatigue that make the setting feel even more hopeless. This is not a story of kids being hunted, it's a story of people slowly realizing they were alone long before the killings began. The violence, too, is remembered incorrectly. Viewers recall gore and shock value, but the true impact comes from the emotional vacuum surrounding each attack. The film seems drained of comfort, as if warmth itself has been stripped from the world. By the time the final twist arrives, it doesn't feel like surprise. It feels like the grim confirmation that escape was never an option. Memory cheapened it. The film never was cheap. Fact 14. American Gothic, 1987. Many viewers insist they remember American Gothic as an odd, almost amusing slice of 80 seconds weirdness, a rural curiosity with eccentric characters and a campy tone, but that impression is a defense mechanism. When seen again, the film sheds every trace of supposed humor and reveals a world suffocating under fanaticism, delusion, and generational rot. The island, once recalled as quaint, becomes a place where time has decayed into ritual. The quirky family, softened in memory into harmless caricatures, now appears unsettlingly fragile children trapped in grown bodies, adults clinging to doctrines that warp every interaction. Smiles stretch too wide, manners feel rehearsed, every gesture vibrates with instability. Revisiting the film exposes how deeply wounded each character is, and how their fractures feed into a spiral of violence that feels inevitable. What viewers once misremembered as dark comedy is actually a claustrophobic nightmare of repression exploding into madness. The horror lies not in jump scares, but in watching a group of people live inside a belief system that has devoured their humanity. Memory turned it whimsical. The truth is anything but. Fact 15. Sweet 16, 1983. People often recall Sweet 16 as a routine teen slasher, bright lights, adolescent drama, and familiar genre beats. But that memory is a softened echo, a comforting rewrite of something far more corrosive. When you revisit the film, the small town no longer feels nostalgic. It feels hostile, simmering with prejudice and suspicion. Every conversation hides an unspoken tension, and every smile feels constructed to conceal a deeper rot. The murders themselves, remembered as typical slasher fare, unfold with a disturbing bluntness. There is nothing playful or exaggerated about them. They feel like eruptions of anger within a community already fraying at the edges. And at the center stands a girl who never quite belongs a presence. Audiences misremember as mysterious when she is, in truth, the mirror reflecting the town's darkest impulses. What people forget is the heaviness, the sense that violence is not an intrusion, but an extension of the environment. The film's true horror is not the killer's identity, but the realization that every character is shaped by silence, resentment, and fear. Rewatching it strips away the illusion of harmless 80 seconds nostalgia and reveals a grim portrait of a town that would rather bury its guilt than confront it. Memory painted Sweet 16 as simple. The film itself never was. Bonus film, The Sender, 1982. In nostalgic fragments, The Sender is remembered as an artsy supernatural drama, soft, dreamy, more surreal than frightening. But this recollection floats above the actual film like a protective layer. Peel it back, and what remains is a deeply unsettling story about unwanted connection and the violence of inherited trauma. The young man at the center, often recalled as mysterious, is revealed to be profoundly wounded. His ability to project his nightmares into others' minds is not a spectacle, it is a breach. Each hallucination is a forced intimacy, pulling everyone around him into the chaos he cannot escape. The hospital, remembered as sterile and quiet, becomes a pressure chamber where no one knows what thoughts are their own anymore. His mother, softened in memory into an eccentric guardian, emerges as a figure shaped by emotional suffocation and religious obsession. Their bond is a closed loop of control and guilt, with no room for healing, only implosion. The dream sequences, once admired for stylistic flair, gain a predatory edge. They do not invite interpretation, they impose themselves. By the end, the line between waking and dreaming collapses into a single, smothering reality. Memory filed The Sender under strange but harmless. The truth is that few films capture psychological invasion with such quiet cruelty. If the films in this episode felt different from how you remembered them, that shift wasn't accidental. Memory hides what unsettles us. It rearranges the darkness into something easier to carry, something that won't follow us into sleep. But when the truth resurfaces, it forces us to confront what we chose, consciously or not, to forget. Tonight, you've seen what happens when those softened memories are restored to their original shape. And this is only the beginning. Join the Night Shriek again. Next time, we'll open a door your mind quietly closed long ago.